Hello and welcome back to Real Seekers. I'm your host, Dale, the Real Seeker. And today we're doing a special fan request video on the Shroud of Turin. This is for Jeremy Johnson. And also we're going to be doing a quick follow-up on one issue that I did with the Digital Gnosis Shroud interview, where I think they were kind of misunderstanding my approach to Bayes' theorem. So I'm just going to give a quick response as to why I think they're incorrect about my 50-50 prior probability for miracles. So that's the plan for today. So let's start with Jeremiah Johnson. And he's got an interesting topic about the Shroud of Turin. Basically, the Shroud of Turin as a foil for conspiracy nutballs. People who say that, well, the Shroud is proof of aliens. E.T. created the Shroud images.
You are really dumb, for real. You are so dumb.
Oh my goodness. And these conspiracy nutballs will say that basically aliens came to Earth and created the Shroud of Turin's images. It's proof of alien technology and aliens. And they say that this is the scholarly position.
Nobody's saying that.
That's insane. Who's saying, who's saying?
Well, that's absurd, and I'll never agree to that.
Yeah, that's what they say.
Nobody says that.
You losers! You losers!
All right, so let's get into this. Jeremy says, no, this is nonsense. The Shroud is not good evidence. And the answer to the question of why the Shroud is not mentioned in the UFO literature or the crop circle cults and stuff like that, or the conspiracy literature, he says, is because, quote unquote, these advocates are not stupid, and actual scientists among them know that the ET or alien hypothesis would absolutely self-destruct in the face of the Shroud facts. It would also provide a valuable test, falsification test, he means, because let's say aliens land on the White House lawn. Well, how do we know that it's not a psychological operation? So I'm reading he's given a write-up on his thinking on this. So I'm just reading what he has to say here. Well, he says, simply ask these people to reproduce the Shroud of Turin then. Ask these aliens if they're real and not a hallucination or some kind of trick. Reproduce the Shroud of Turin. And Jeremy's argument here is that would be impossible. The aliens couldn't do it, therefore proving aliens never made the Shroud of Turin. Okay, so going on, he says that the UFO phenomenon, which he calls UAP, I guess that's the updated version, what it's called, but UFO phenomenon now has not only the attention of the public, but also the attention of Congress. And one might ask why whistleblowers are not forthcoming to request a congressional inquiry into the data kept secret concerning the Shroud. There is so Jeremy says there is a connection between the UFO phenomenon and the Shroud, and that connection is high intensity radiation. The difference being that the UFO signature does not display the ability to manipulate that radiation that we see on the Shroud. Okay, so Dale speaking here, the difference being that the UFO signature does not display the ability to manipulate that radiation. Now, just offhand, I don't believe in UFOs and aliens and stuff like this. I think that's against the Christian worldview in the first place. But just based on an anecdotal level, based on some of the stories, I do remember hearing about a UFO, one person where they think he touched a spacecraft, a UFO, and it emitted radiation, poisoning him. And they even have burn marks from the 1960s on his chest in a grid pattern and on his top. And some people are speculating, well, that was because there was radiation found in that area, radioactivity. So that would suggest, at least according to the stories, some UFOs can and do manipulate radiation as part of their craft. So I'm not sure. Yeah, I'm not sure this is true or what he's saying, that there's a difference in the ability to manipulate that radiation. Maybe he means in terms of the vertical mapping, the shroud, the radiation strictly went in vertical lines, whereas radiation from aliens would still be a natural phenomenon, and it radiates in all directions equally, which is what even the UFO stories themselves admit. So the radiation is natural, not supernatural. Maybe that's the difference. And if that's the case, then I agree. Okay, so going on, Jeremy says, quote unquote, another coincidence we find between UAP and shroud radiation is the relationship between the disappearance of the UAP and the disappearance of the body of Jesus. Physicist, he says Jack Sephardi, that's Jonathan Sephardi. He's a physicist, a chemist, I believe. He's a young Earth creationist, famous for his books. I loved reading his books, stuff like that, when he worked at Answers in Genesis. Maybe for all I know, he's still there. But he says John Sephardi has called the ultraviolet burst of radiation from a UFO, when it disappears, the expected signature of engaging a Alcubierre, so ALCUBIER warp drive. I have no idea what that means on my end, but let me just play a clip from the video of Jonathan Sephardi, this scientist, talking about this here. So this is where Dr. Jonathan Sephardi, he's ruling out aliens as ridiculous just because of the laws of physics. It's impossible, physically impossible, that aliens could travel to Earth and create shroud images or do anything. But here's his take on that front.
Well, I mean, for one thing, as we say in our film, there's this trying to get from one star to the other is way beyond even the laws of physics to do. I did the calculations myself on our website. Take a spaceship to a third of the speed of light, you need more energy than it has than the whole of the world's energy production. And also to try to stop it and not get crushed by G-forces, you need the whole length of the solar system to stop the thing, to break it evenly. Wow. And you couldn't turn because a lurching force would kill you unless you turned on a radius much bigger than the entire solar system. Okay, so you couldn't turn it on Earth's radius of orbit because you can calculate that the G-force would crush you if you tried to. And this is only 1/3 of light speed.
Is that problem solved perhaps by anti-gravitational technology where you create your own inertia? Warping space. But I think the other thing is you could hit a grain of dust on traveling at that sort of even sublight speed, and you just the theory of formula is it's E equals half mv squared. Okay, so you square the velocity, velocity goes up by 10-fold, the energy goes up by 100-fold. Okay. See, if you have something going at 10,000 times faster than the fastest rocket today, the energies involved and the G-force, the turning G-force are about 100 million times greater. Wow.
Okay, so and warping of space, all you're doing is concentrating these dust grains in front of you, so you can hit more of them. But it's even a single dust grain is like several tons of TNT exploding when it hits you. That's the sort of speed. I think people overlook just simple things like, which is really, I think, just first year university physics.
Interesting. So
not that difficult to calculate, but it would actually the dust grain collision at that speed would blow the ship up.
And there's no way to create a sort of gravitational repellent field that would just push everything out of the way before it hits you?
Well, how much energy you're going to need, though? You see, if it's hitting you at this sort of energy, you need that sort of energy creation to repel it that way. Yeah. So,
wow.
That's where you get it from. Even antimatter, which is the highest you can possibly go, is antimatter and matter collision, which is total conversion of mass to energy. Even that would not be enough.
Wow.
So, I mean, you can't get better than that.
Okay. So it seems like then any kind of interstellar, extrasolar system, interplanetary travel, not very likely.
No.
That being said, then the alien phenomenon, not aliens. Is it a demonic deception?
Okay, so that is Dr. Jonathan Sephardi, an absolutely physical impossibility, virtually impossible, that aliens could travel here and, as a practical joke, create shroud images to trick us. The laws of physics just rule out extrasolar system travel. No amount of made-up Star Trek or warp travel or something like that will get you off the hook. Absolute fool. if you believe aliens could come from another planet and come to our solar system just to create shroud images as a trick or something like that. Ridiculous skeptic. Ridiculous. Okay, so going back to Jeremy Johnson, so he's saying that, quote unquote, another phenomenon that has overlap due to radiation with the shroud and UFOs is crop circles, some of which has evidence of being formed by microwave radiation. One thing that I want to say here is that this is not an area of overlap. So I'm not familiar about, you know what crop circles are in cornfields. They're basic circles, or ever increasingly complex shapes and stuff like that. And this is supposedly proof of aliens landing in the fields and crushing the corn. 99% of these things are complete bunk. I would argue 100% of them are obviously bunk. I don't believe in this stuff, but Jeremy's saying there's a connection here because of microwave radiation. Now that's false in the first place. Okay, I would say because no form of electromagnetic radiation formed the shroud images. Under Bob Rucker's theory, which I think is the only one that fully works, forms of radiation in the EM field, like ultraviolet or infrared, they're also pretty good theories, but they have some issues with superficiality and stuff like that. So they're not perfect. But in terms of radiation on the microwave level, that just doesn't work right away. Everybody, skeptic and pro shroud, no one's working with microwave radiation. So let me just show a clip from my panel review show on the radiation theories, and show that, yeah, microwave radiation is not posited to create the shroud images. This is a disanalogy between the alien phenomenon and, the stories about aliens in crop circles and the Shroud of Turin. So I disagree with what Jeremy is saying here. There is no overlap, but let me just show that clip.
Barry, I'll go to you next. In terms of the radiation hypotheses, just kind of outline what are the various types of radiation hypotheses that have been proposed to date, and of those, excluding particle radiation, how do those theories perform in terms of explaining the shroud's physical and chemical features?
Well, we're talking electromagnetic radiation, which, as that brief picture that you popped up on the screen just now showed, comes in various different wavelengths. It all travels at the same speed through air. Yes, if you pop that one up, that will look really good. And it goes, as you can see, from long wavelength, low frequency on the left-hand side, which you've got as ELF, and then very low frequency. And we're into radio waves. Then we come to microwaves, and then we arrive at infrared, visible, and so on. Now, the crucial thing about making an image on a cloth, let's suppose that we take for granted that this radiation is coming from the body, and we suppose that it is traveling through some air and arriving at the cloth, and it makes an image related to the distance that it's traveled through the air. Now, the most important thing about that then is that there must be less radiation reaching the cloth than there was when it set out from the body over a very small distance. And of all the wavelengths that we see there, very few of them are attenuated sufficiently in air for there to be any difference from when they leave the body to when they arrive at the cloth over a distance of between, say, 1 and 4 centimeters. Whereas what we've got to find is some sort of radiation that will be very effective at very small distances, say a millimeter, but not effective at all over 40 millimeters. And it turns out that the best one for that is ultraviolet radiation. This is the reason why Paolo Di Lazzaro has been trying to produce discoloration on cloth using ultraviolet radiation, because that is certain wavelengths of it, probably more accurate than me, but that is attenuated sufficiently so that you can have a lot of it, which makes an effect on the cloth when it's in contact, but it fades away to nothing over a couple of inches. Curiously, as we go to slightly longer wavelengths, visible light makes almost no difference at all. So the light from my two hands if I put one in front of me and one behind me, I've got to jiggle myself so that I can see where I am. I can see the one in front of me. Now, what's happened to the other one? Let's put them both. Where's my camera? Can you see both hands? Anyway, yes, here we go. Now the light from those two hands is almost exactly the same, even though one is big and one is small. Over the distance, they're about 6 inches apart, but the light is not attenuated at all. The back hand does not appear darker than the front hand. And indeed, if I put my hand here, my face appears brighter than my hand because of the light. Whereas if I move as far back as I can and put my hand like that, now if the light was attenuated at all, you'd be seeing me much darker than my hand, which you're not. So the one thing we can be absolutely certain about is that the image was not formed by a flash of light, a flash of visible light. Whereas all those who have grabbed Paolo's paper and said, ultraviolet light, therefore this is, there was a flash of light in the tomb, and it fits very beautifully with biblical analogies of the Lord glowing white during transubstantiation, during the not transubstantiation, the transfiguration and all that sort of thing. But that could absolutely not have had any effect on the shroud. Now, the next one out, in between, visible light is no use, but on one side we had the ultraviolet light, which certainly does work. On the other side, we've got infrared light, which is also what we would normally call it heat rays. But that is also attenuated by distance. So that if you put your hand close to a fire, it feels hot. But as you move your hand away, it very quickly feels cold again. And so we have an Italian bunch under Paolo di Lazzaro experimenting with ultraviolet light, and we have a French bunch under Christophe Donnet, who is experimenting with infrared radiation. And both of those are attenuated in air. All the other wavelengths of light are not attenuated sufficiently to produce a recognizable image.
Yep. Yeah, exactly. Because I think with the shroud images, the image is only attenuated through 4 centimeters or something like that. After that, they didn't encode it.
So it must go from able to discolor cellulose to not able to discolor cellulose over a very short distance. So no one has studied wavelengths. I know wavelengths that were shorter than ultraviolet, but that band between infrared and ultraviolet, people have attempted to make images with that, and it looks as though infrared and ultraviolet could both be able to scorch cloth, whereas visible light can't.
Okay, so as you can see, the Shroud skeptic Hugh Ferry and nuclear engineer, pro-Shroud expert Bob Rucker fully agreed with Hugh when he came back, when he responded there. Look, we know for a fact the Shroud image is attenuated after 4 centimeters. After 4 centimeters, whatever encoded it, the images on the Shroud did not work. It did not continue encoding images. And unfortunately, microwaves do not attenuate after 4 centimeters. Therefore, it's scientifically falsified. It's impossible that microwave radiation created the Shroud images. There's zero connection. You only have infrared, ultraviolet radiation, or particle radiation, as Bob Rucker argues for with his charged proton hypothesis and the vertically collimated radiation burst hypothesis. Okay, so let's continue with Jeremy. So he said, quote unquote, now one thing we do know, as a matter of fact, is that the Shroud is simply been what it is since the Middle Ages, date given by the carbon-14 analysis. I don't accept the validity of that test. I'm merely stating that no one disputes the Shroud being made between 1200 and 1400 AD. That's true. On the other hand, both the UFO and crop circle phenomenons have increased in complexity since they began in the early 20th century. So UFOs began with data consistent with simple spaceships, simple little silver circles, simple little circular crop circles. But now they become increasingly complex, including the signatures of warp drive. So you might say we weren't able to understand that data in the past, but that's not true. The technology for that type of observation existed and was understood by the military in 1948. And craft entering U.S. airspace and proximate to military installations would have seen it just fine. The Air Force Project Blue Book withheld that data to prevent panic. The problem with that theory is the U.S. Air Force did not prevent John Jackson of the U.S. Air Force Academy from forming the STIRP team of NASA and Pentagon affiliated scientists. So it's true they were. Yep, John Jackson was in the Air Force. He was the founder of the STIRP team, and he got other scientists from other weapons labs, like Sandia Labs and stuff like that, to come on board. So Jeremy continues, and afterwards taking the data to Russia to present it to the Russian Nuclear Academy. If it's top secret for UFOs, then why was it not top secret for the Shroud and shared with Cold War enemies? So I think what this is Dale speaking again. So Jeremy is trying to say there's this disanalogy here that if you conspiracy nutballs are going to say that, well, the Shroud is another UFO type phenomenon. These ET came in a UFO and zap created the Shroud images. This would have been treated, classified top secret under the Blue Book project of the Air Force and treated as a UFO or alien phenomenon. And therefore, John Jackson wouldn't have been able to make it public. His STIRP project would have been classified top secret. He wouldn't be able to go and share that with the Ruskies over in, during the Cold War era. That's the disanalogy that I understand Jeremy's making here. He's saying the Shroud has nothing to do with aliens, and even the government knew that at this time. Otherwise, they wouldn't have allowed STIRP to form publicly, or let alone the research to be given to the enemies in Russia, in communist Soviet Union Russia. So I think that's the point he's making. Okay, fair enough. And he also says there's a disanalogy in that the Shroud we don't have to posit increasingly complex. I don't know what he's saying there. So yeah, I don't know that part. But okay, so Jeremy continues, quote unquote, like the UFO phenomenon, the crop circle phenomenon began with simple circles that were explained with stomping boards, and then began to increase in design complexity and speculation and evidence of the use of microwave radiation. See Physics World article about how this may have been done with modern technology, okay, and computer-aided design, GPS, and handheld magnetrons. And then whatever made the crop circle disappears. Okay? So then he stresses radiation, complex design, disappearance. All three were evident from the Shroud from the time of Secondo Pia's photograph in the 1800s. Well, I disagree with that. That's not true. But he keeps going on. But slowly accumulated in the cases of UFOs and crop circles. So in terms of the anti-gravity stuff and the fact that radiation was necessary, that wasn't necessarily true, right? So once Secondo Pia discovered the photonegativity in the 1898, look, there were still artistic mechanisms that could easily explain the photonegativity, and in fact do. Almost all, except for the traditional painting hypothesis, are able to account for this feature. So it's just not true that, we discovered photonegativity in 1898, therefore that proves it had to be radiation or a complex design and that sort of thing. So I'm not sure that follows. Look, and the Shroud findings, they slowly accumulated as well, right? Because so in 1900 to 1902, we had the medical or anatomical findings at the French Academy of Science. In 1937, there was testing on direct contact and vapors coming from the body in the Scientific American Science Journal by Paul Vignon there. In 1976, that's when the three-dimensionality was proved. And then in 1978, we had STIRP and all the subsequent experiments. So there is more and more evidence accumulating slowly over time for the complex design and radiation hypotheses. So yeah, I'm just not sure that what you're saying here is true here, Jeremy. Okay, so Jeremy goes on. Another difference is that the shroud is important because it validates an already existing established religion, and the science supports the already existing claim. So I fully agree with this point of Jeremy, that there is, under the specified complexity criteria, the Shroud of Turin provides specification. There is a religion authenticating context, detectably present and readily identifiable. This is clearly Jesus Christ of the Gospels, uniquely him, and meant to authenticate and depict Jesus and his central essential events of death for our sins and resurrection from the dead. Absolute proof. So yeah, I totally agree with this. There is a specified purpose for the images being formed. Jeremy goes on. The UFO and crop circle ET cults, on the other hand, are manufactured by quote-unquote prophets after the fact of each new piece of data observed from those phenomena, despite their attempts to integrate their ideas with past revelations, such as the popular attempt to eisegetically read ETs back into extraterrestrials, back into ancient texts, not to validate the ancient texts, but to, on the contrary, to attempt to validate their cults. Totally agree with you here, Jeremy. This is just absolute bunk on the part of ancient alien type fools and hacks who claim that ancient aliens visited Earth and built the pyramids and helped humans build all this stuff.
That's insane. Who's saying, like, who specifically, who's saying?
Nobody says that.
Total nonsense. And then they say, well, their ancient aliens are mentioned in the text. I mean, they talk about nuclear bombs and only scientific knowledge we could have in the future in the 20th century. And yet these ancient texts are all talking about these incredible things. Well, take a look at Ancient Aliens Debunked.
Dr. Oppenheimer quoted after the New Mexico atomic test.
So the ancient astronaut theory claims that the Mahabharata speaks of nuclear warfare. Let's see what specifically they say it says.
One reference that we have, for example, speaks of these explosions that were brighter than 1,000 suns. And when these blasts occurred, the suns were twirling in the air. Trees went up in flames, and there was just this mass destruction. After those blasts, people who survive started to lose their hair, and nails started to fall out. I mean, right there, we have a concise reference to radiation poisoning, nuclear fallout. And those texts are thousands of years old.
The Mahabharata actually doesn't say any of that. These exact claims about the hair and nails falling off and an explosion brighter than 1,000 suns has been repeated by ancient astronaut theorists so many times that they think it's true. But the origin of this line was from a French book called Morning of the Magicians. No one that makes this claim will actually cite where in the Mahabharata this claim appears, which makes it very difficult for people to call them out on this, because the Mahabharata contains over 1.8 million words. So if you just say, it's in there somewhere, just trust me, you can pretty much get away with anything. As you might have guessed by now, they have a really good reason for covering their tracks by not citing a reference.
Okay, so moving on. Jeremy says, if the UFOs are what is claimed by the whistleblowers, then why have they not presented the evidence for the Shroud gathered by institutions and employees of the U.S. government about the Shroud of Turin to Congress, along with the whistleblowers' information of recovered craft and biological entities, since they have so much in common, including biological entities? So again, Jeremy is trying to say, like, well, when they presented the information for extraterrestrials and UFOs to Congress, if the Shroud is truly made by ET, why didn't they show the Shroud of Turin to Congress at that time? He says, radiation, complex design, disappearance, and biological entities. If you can't beat the Shroud advocates, then try to create the phenomena to make them join you. That's basically what he has to say here. Jeremy has to say, and yeah, I agree in large part with the conclusion that the Shroud of Turin is not created by aliens. That's ridiculous. You're an ignorant fool if you believe that's what happened. It's impossible for aliens to come here to create shroud images from another solar system anyways, given the laws of physics. Virtually impossible and extremely unlikely. And that's before we even getting into assess the hypothesis on its own merits in terms of the evidence for or against it, which there's none, and there's so much evidence. What would be the motivation to create this hoax, shroud image hoax? And also not to mention the fact that God would not allow aliens to conduct such a hoax, because that would lead to undue confusion, where innocent people like me would become Christians, believing Jesus rose from the dead for their sins, and my ultimate purpose in creation, the fate of my ultimate purpose in creation, would be denied, unjustifiably denied to me, because God allowed these aliens to trick us uniquely for the Christian faith with supernatural, what seems like supernatural, miraculous images or extraordinary images authenticating the Christian faith. A real maximally great being could not allow undue confusion of that sort to happen, and therefore we can rule out aliens right out of the gate. Impossible for demons, Satan, aliens, any of the sort to create these extraordinary images. All right, so that's my take on that. So yeah, next we're going to move on to responding to the prior probability of miracles on the Digital Gnosis channel. All right, so continuing on, let's look at the two Shroud skeptics, Digital Gnosis and James Fedor. And specifically, I'm currently trying to organize round 3. Thankfully, Bob Rucker has agreed to come on to refute the skeptics and respond to their objections on the carbon-14 as well as the image-forming hypothesis through radiation in great detail. And I'm currently trying to get Dr. Thomas McAvoy to join in to speak about his findings in the prestigious science journal Applied Optics on the ultraviolet fluorescence intensity levels. So hopefully that will work out with that debate. I think that'll be better than me and Otangelo teaming up as a debate. I don't think the atheists are going to take that seriously in the audience and stuff like that. So I thankfully begged Bob, and he said he would come on. And I'm hoping Tom will come on, and I will moderate a discussion between the skeptics, Nathan and James, versus Bob and Tom. That said, there is one part where I'm an expert in the philosophy of miracles, and I've studied this and that sort of thing, and talking about Bayes' theorem and the prior probability of miracles that I want to address. So let's play some clips first, and then I'll give my take on this.
If you make the prediction putting 50 centimeters as a parameter into his neutron model, you'd get a different date that should come out. So it's completely inconsistent. So the point is that I don't think this Sidarium is actually doing the work in this. I mean, maybe what I'd find more convincing is if we knew it was placed over the head or something, like as well as the shroud. And so you had like, you know, a very small degree of freedom, like maybe a few millimeters or something like that. And you're explaining it in terms of stuff being absorbed by one layer of linen and then like something like that. I mean, it's still not going to be good enough because you've got the kind of problem of the priors. So even if that was the case, like the priors so low, but that would be better than this kind of like moving it anywhere within a sort of like reasonably sized space.
Yeah. So I agree that there are degrees of freedom. I disagree with you that it's as free as you're wanting to make it seem, because there are certain data that restrict it. For example, the Gospel of John, right? So if it's inconsistent, if it's on his head underneath the shroud, well, if you don't go for biblical inerrancy, maybe that's not a problem. But then
maybe think about this with that piece of cloth, right? If it's supposed to be uniformly affected by the radiation, but it's placed on like a flat plane with Jesus' body, like what's the radiation doing? Like, does it hit the side of it, like what, or is it like suspended in the air like this so it hits even, like, again, there's all these kind of details that I'm not sure.
Okay, so this is what sparks our discussion. I started answering him with the cloth collapse, totally irrelevant stuff, and then we get into the miracles discussion here. This is where it fell off the rails. So this is just an example where on the spot I give a totally wrong, different answer. So basically the answer to his question is, he's saying, well, how does the neutron radiation work? How does it hit the Sidarium if it's on the side? Is the Sidarium floating in the air and then the neutrons hit it? Or is it laying flat on the shelf bench and then the neutrons somehow go on it? So he doesn't understand how Bob's model works in terms of neutron irradiation. Look, the reason there are different amounts is because the neutrons go right through the cloth, bounce off the limestone walls. So in the case of his backside, there's a difference than the front side amount of neutrons because they keep going in and out, bouncing off the walls and through the body and stuff like that, back and forth. And they do this at different rates depending on the location of the body versus the limestone walls that they're bouncing off of. So they're bouncing all over the cave, going through the cloth and all this stuff multiple times and stuff like that. And that includes bouncing off the limestone walls and hitting the sudarium, which is lying flat down on the shelf naturally. It's not floating in the air or anything like that. And that is all calculated precisely by Bob's model. So let me just show that, because I never showed that in the tomb. In terms of the sudarium of Oviedo, where was the placement? So let me show that now. Okay, so this is Bob's calculation here from his carbon-14. You can see this is where he posits the Shroud of Turin was. And you can see we get these 700 AD dates that perfectly match the sudarium, or it could have been here, which would have matched the carbon-14 sudarium. So there's at least two locations that would give us the 700 AD, thereabouts, carbon-14 dating, plus or minus, within the 95% degree of confidence, and fit the data. So on this basis, Bob is saying, okay, well, this is where the sudarium must have been placed. This makes the most sense because this is where the head would have been, or maybe it was here, and then that would fit. But I get their criticism of saying, well, what if the sudarium was placed here? Well, in that case, obviously, we would get a carbon-14 date of 464 AD, and there would be a contradiction in terms here, right? But what they're saying is that Bob didn't know that in advance, right? It's not like his model predicted, or that we know the sudarium was placed here at this part of the bench. Maybe it was here, and you know, so he's using his model, fitting the data that he already knows about the carbon dating and saying, okay, so we know that we got 700 AD or thereabouts, plus or minus, for the sudarium of Oviedo. Therefore, I'm just going to assume the sudarium was placed wherever I get, my model gives me 700 AD, plus or minus 100 years or so, plus or minus whatever the standard deviation is there, right? That happens to be in these locations that are consistent with the carbon-14. So he goes, the sudarium must have been placed here or here. And most likely it was placed on this side because that's where the head was, according to his model, based on the Shroud of Turin and assessment and the neutrons there. So that's what they were saying there, right? And I just wanted to answer that question because that's what sparked us off into miracles. And I just wasn't even answering his question, which I don't know what happens when I'm on the spot. Sometimes I hear the questions wrong. My brain just freezes. It's just the way I am. I need to be very well prepared in advance. And there I can do incredibly in-depth research and stuff like that and speak. If I'm just not prepared because I didn't do any research prior to this, I thought it was just going to be an informal discussion where I kind of raised issues they missed and reviewing them and their reasoning, rather than them kind of interrogating me on my reasoning and stuff like that. I would have done the research and stuff like that and have been prepared. I didn't know that was going to be the format of the show. That said, I'm glad that they did do that probing because it shows, hey, they want to understand. They want to get into the details. And that's why I'm hoping in round 3, let's do that. I will send them the papers in advance. We're going to have Bob Rucker and hopefully Dr. Thomas McAvoy in the flesh there to debate with them and discuss with them. Okay, so let's continue on with the video clips about the miracle specifically. That's the only part I want to respond to as the philosopher here. I call it a Bayes-ish method. So it's not Bayes' theorem technically that I am using. It's much more simplistic and much more intuitive, right? So the way I do it, there's only two hypotheses. There's either God did it this way or that God did not do it this way. And I'm saying
I don't think that's true. I think
well, he's just negating it, right? So
yeah, well, those are logically exhaustive, but the problem is that one of those is a catch-all hypothesis.
Yes.
So so either God did it this way, it's like saying today, either I
won the lottery or I didn't win the lottery.
Yeah,
50-50.
right, exactly.
No,
but actually,
50-50.
But then this is where we get into the question of priors, right? Because what you're doing, this is where I said like drawing, you know, a circle around what you hit, because you're saying he did have those reasons because my explanation is true. But what we're trying to do is establish whether or not we should think the explanation is true. And in order to do that, we're thinking of all the possible reasons God could have and what differences they would lead to see if it predicts this explanation well or not.
The issue is how to come up with priors for this. So remember, the hypothesis is that we can explain the gradation of dating through a neutron emission hypothesis. We then need to consider what's the prior probability, that is prior to observing the shroud, or prior to observing the dating of the shroud, I guess. What is the probability that God would use this mechanism? So Bayesian statistics itself doesn't tell you how to get that prior. We need some additional principles to come to that prior. So the idea that it should be accorded a prior of 0.5, as I've argued, Nathan and I have argued, seems very implausible, because there seem to be many ways, at least conceptually, that God could have produced an equivalent image, given that God is omnipotent. And so it's unclear why, of all of the possible space, we'd accord half of it to neutron emission. That seems fairly implausible. It would seem more plausible to accord similar portions to a variety of different hypotheses. So that's, I think, where at least I'm getting stuck here.
Okay, so I think I've maybe found a good way to explain why I'm hesitant with what you guys are saying. So here's an analogy, right? So let's say we have data, we hear hoofbeats, right? And we have a total of 3 options. So it was either a zebra, a donkey, or a horse. So therefore we say, oh, well, there's 3 options. So the prior probability is 1/3. It's not 50%. That's ridiculous. It's not 50-50 that it's a horse. It would be 1/3. But that's saying that the prior probability, and then if we add a 4th thing that has hoofbeats, I can't think of something right now, a cow or something like that. Oh, so now suddenly the prior probability is 1/4. Well, that it was a horse. Well, what we're doing here is we're asking, what's the prior probability that is a horse, just as a random guess, right? So randomly, I'm hearing hoofbeats. What's the prior prob that it would be a zebra or a horse? In that case, yeah, it is these 1/4 or 1/3, whatever number of options. But I don't think that's what we're saying. We're not saying that God is up there in heaven saying, I have all these infinite ways to create shroud images. I'm going to pick neutron absorption. There we go. You're the lucky winner.
Oh, no. Yeah. He doesn't have to be.
You're looking at it the wrong way. The question is not, is God picking between these? The question is, we have to figure out what God wanted to do, and we don't know. So we can't see a reason why he would prefer neutrons over any of the other possibilities. And so therefore we accord them equal weight. It's not God is picking randomly between them. It's we are according them equal weight in our judgment because we can't see a difference between them, at least at this stage, like before considering the dating evidence. So that's how Bayesian approaches work, because it's an epistemic probability based on our knowledge. It's not a statement about like mechanisms in the world that produce outcomes. It might have been certain from God's point of view that he would always do it this one way, but we don't know that if we can't see the reason.
In order to understand what I'm talking about with the 50-50 versus the 1/3, or 1 divided by infinity, whatever the prior probability is. So here's a chart of probabilities, right? So I'm saying the philosophical principle of indifference, the agnostic range, is 50%. That means we have no evidence one way, no evidence the other way, right? So if we picture Bayes' theorem on the line, there's 50% right here in the middle, 0%, 0 to 49% here, and then this is 51% to 100%. And there are 2 hypotheses. So I evaluate something simplistically, not in the proper Bayesian sense, but a Bayes-ish method. And what I do is say, okay, this is the hypothesis that my hypothesis, that God rose Jesus from the dead, whatever it is probably true. We can prove it is in fact probably true as an ontological claim, right? Because the hypothesis is it's either true or it's false. There's only 2 options. So that's why if we have no evidence either way, the agnostic point is 50-50. Your hypothesis is either true or it's not true. They affirm that's logically exhaustive. That includes all the other options, right? So if you have three options and you okay, you hear hoofbeats and you go, my hypothesis is a horse is making those hoofbeats. If you have evidence, 51%, either background evidence or a posteriori evidence, 51% to 100%, that's you saying my hypothesis is probably true. Okay? If you're at the 50%, that's you're saying you're agnostic. You don't know. Maybe the hypothesis is true, or maybe as a separate claim, the evidence proves that the hypothesis is probably in fact false. It's improbable to be true. And that represents anywhere from 0% to 49%, with 0% meaning it's impossible that the horse is making those hoofbeats. So that's saying we know for a fact it is the zebra or the donkey, not the thing. Or in the case of 100%, that means we know for a fact it is the horse making those hoofbeats. 50-50 means it's either true that it's the horse making the hoofbeats, and it's equally probable that it's not the horse making the hoofbeats. All we know is we hear hoofbeats, and in the absence of anything else, we don't know. Now, here's the problem they're doing with the way my Bayesish approach, because they're saying, well, no, the prior probability would be 1/3, not 50%, because there's three options, and the likelihood, not the probability, but the likelihood that it is the horse just arbitrarily and randomly picking something, you would have a 1/3 chance of being right if you just randomly pick a horse, right? Out of a zebra and a donkey. So let's place that. So that would mean there's a 33% prior probability back here that the horse, that it's true that the horse hypothesis, that it is in fact probably a horse, right? So in other words, we're saying it's improvably improbable that it is in fact the horse. And that's where they go off. That's where this likelihood nonsense goes off. No, just because you add options, that doesn't make it increasingly unlikely that your hypothesis is either true or false, right? It's not like, so 1/3, right? 1 divided by 3 options. Well, that means, okay, that means in fact, they're probably, because there's 2 out of 3 options where it's not a horse, that means it's in fact not a horse. We have 100% minus 1/3 would equal a 67% probability that it's in fact false that it's the horse. No, we have no evidence that makes it improbable that it is a horse. Just because we have 3 equally probable options to choose from, right? All we hear is hoofbeats. That's equally probable to be explained by a zebra, equally probable to be explained by a donkey, equally probable to be explained by a horse. So you would have to have 3 separate lines here under my Bayesish approach, okay? And I'm using direct, simple probabilities. So if we had evidence to, so let's say we had background evidence that did lower the probability. So let's say we pretend instead of a horse, the hypothesis is that it's a zebra. Okay. Well, just because the likelihood is 1/3, that we're still at the 50-50 mark. It's either true that it's a zebra or it's false that it's a zebra. In other words, it's not true that it's a zebra. Okay. So that would be anywhere from 49% to 0% proven that it is in fact a zebra versus no, we know for a fact it probably is a zebra. That's 51% to 100%. Under my Bayesish approach. The agnostic position, if we have no way to tell, is 50%. Maybe it's true that it's a zebra. Maybe it's not true that it's a zebra. We just don't know. That's the proper way to use Bayesish approach here. That's why I assign the 50%. Now, if you gave relevant evidence, the likelihood is not relevant evidence. The likelihood doesn't make it improbable in point of fact that it is a zebra. But you might say, well, given our background evidence, it's improbable to be a zebra because zebras are from Africa and this is the United States of America. And it's unlikely zebras are not wild or native here, and it's unlikely that a zebra could escape from the zoo and just be randomly running down the street. So in that case, that is relevant background evidence that would actually lower the prior probability and makes it in fact improbable that the hoofbeats you're hearing are in fact a zebra. You know, you can put that wherever you want. That, okay, there's a 10% probability that maybe a zebra escaped the zoo and just happens to be running down the street. But again, this is on the basis of relevant background evidence that you're lowering or raising the prior probability on, right? Now, in this case, we start at 50-50 as the agnostic default value. If we have no evidence in a vacuum, it's either true that it's a zebra running down the street or it's false. Only those two options, 50-50. Just adding, if you add in the background evidence is, well, we have three options, therefore the likelihood is 1/3. If we were just randomly choosing which one it is, well, there's a 1/3 chance we would guess correctly. I would say that is not relevant background evidence. That doesn't push the needle on the facts on whether or not the hypothesis is in fact true or versus is in fact false, right? So it has to be evidence that proves on a balance of probabilities it is in fact true, 51% to 100%, or relevant evidence that makes it in fact improbable to be true. In other words, is probably false, anywhere between 0% to 49%, right? So it's this part of the equation. This is the Bayes-ish method. Anything less than 50% is you making the claim to know for a fact and have proof, relevant evidence, either background evidence or a posteriori evidence proving it's improbable that it's true that it's a zebra. In other words, that we can prove it's probably false that it's a zebra. On this side of the equation, 51 to 100%. This means we have relevant evidence that pushes the needle up and says, yup, it's probably true. We can prove it is, in fact, a zebra, up to 51% to 100%, whatever degree the evidence is on that front, right? And you can picture certain evidence, relevant evidence from that, from eyewitness testimony. Maybe you see a news report saying that a zebra is in your neighborhood, and you just happen to hear these hoofbeats and stuff like that, and maybe you hear somebody saying, look out, a zebra is running on it, a zebra is coming down and it's going to hit you, and okay, that must be a zebra, or something like that, right? So that's the way this works. It doesn't work based on the way these skeptics are arguing with the likelihood. The fact that there's a 1/3 chance of randomly guessing correctly what it is has nothing to do with actually proving in reality that your hypothesis is false, right? So that's just wrong, in my opinion. Now, I want to show something. Here's Bayes' theorem proper, right? So not the Bayes-ish approach. This is the general Bayes theorem used for the resurrection hypothesis. You can see it's a conditional probability here, which I don't use in the Bayes-ish approach, right? I don't go, what is the probability we would have the evidence of the empty tomb, the appearances and all that, given we assume the resurrection is true, times the background prior probability, and then do it that way. That's not how I do it, much more directly and simply. And I just say, look, the empty tomb proves my resurrection hypothesis is true to whatever degree. In fact, I think it's less than 50% on its own. I think that a stolen body by a necromancer or someone who heard Jesus's prophecy about rising in 3 days, that's equally probable, in my opinion, as an explanation. So in that case, that wouldn't count as direct evidence proving the probability of my resurrection hypothesis. The appearance to the 12. This I assign something like 60% or 60, somewhere in the 60s, 60%. That does prove, given we have this fact of the appearance up to the 12, that does prove directly the resurrection hypothesis is probably true at the 60% level, right? So we would be up here on the basis of the appearance to the 12 for the resurrection. Okay, so that's how I don't use Bayes' theorem proper with conditional probabilities. But that's irrelevant because we weren't talking about that at all. What they were going after me for was the problem of the priors. So this factor right here, what is the prior probability? Before we look at direct evidences for your hypothesis, right? For the miracle, whatever the hypothesis is, in this case, it's the resurrection. Just on the basis of our background evidence, what is the prior probability that the resurrection hypothesis would be true? And they're trying to say, well, it would be 1 divided by infinity because they want to basically subtly change the hypothesis, right? So they pretend like, okay, well, the main hypothesis is God raised Jesus from the dead. Okay, so let's pretend that's the hypothesis in general. Then they're saying, well, there's an infinite amount of ways. They're exaggerating, but let's say there's a large amount of ways God could have done it. As an omnipotent, omniscient being, surely, yes, it's true that God could have raised Jesus from the dead without using neutron irradiation and proton irradiation to create the images on the shroud. And neutron radiation influencing the carbon-14 dates. That's true. I affirm that there's more than one option, right? So let's say there's 100 options, just to keep things simple. 100 different ways God could have used it. There's only one path, or 2 or 3 or something where he uses neutrons or something like that. Okay, so there's a 2 out of 100 chance or a 1 out of 100 chance. So therefore, they're saying, yeah, there's literally a 1% prior probability, very, very low. And when you multiply that, even if you have very strong evidence, it's not going to equal very much, and you're going to be you're always going to be concluding that a miracle didn't happen. The resurrection didn't happen because this 1% is so low. And remember, they were arguing it's 1 divided by infinity, which means like nothing will ever change your mind on this unless you have infinity on this end or something like that. In which case you have infinity divided by infinity, and you're going to get 50%. You can never conclude that the resurrection is true or that a miracle happened. They're cheating and playing games to prevent you from ever concluding a miracle happened before you even get out of the door. But remember what James said, right? How do we go about calculating this? Is it really this frequent, as I call it, frequentist, but that's not the technically right word. It's more the likelihood type argument of going, well, God could have raised Jesus with neutrons. He could have raised Jesus with protons. He could have raised Jesus with electrons. He could have raised Jesus in a purple dress. Could have raised Jesus in a pink dress. Could have raised Jesus. Oh my gosh, there's a 1 divided by infinity amount, right? So first of all, look, the hypothesis, you've got to keep that straight. So this hypothesis that God raised Jesus from the dead, you need to change that if you're going to be specifying raised Jesus from the dead in the specific way he did, using neutron radiation to influence the carbon-14 of the shroud and proton radiation to create the images, whatever, or ultraviolet, whatever you want to say. That minimally, for what we were talking about, which was just the carbon dating, God raised Jesus from the dead using, but not limited to, neutrons to influence the radiocarbon dates of the Shroud of Turin, the burial shroud on Jesus. So you're having to modify the hypothesis. So the way we calculate the prior probabilities is with something called the Jefferey Conditionalization Formula, something that the two skeptics didn't even mention. I guarantee you they're aware of it, but they didn't talk about this, right? So in the first place, okay, here is how you calculate the prior probability of the modified resurrection hypothesis, that God would raise Jesus from the dead with neutron irradiation. It's also included in this hypothesis because God had a religious motivation for doing so. That's the hypothesis, and they're leaving out that little bit about because God had a proper motivation for doing so as a part of the hypothesis we're testing. And that's going to make a big difference. It's not just God raised Jesus from the dead with neutron irradiation randomly, arbitrarily, for no reason. No, he had reason. That's what the hypothesis that we're assessing as stating, right? And that's where I was getting into God's providence, and this is the second of two best possible worlds, because I was trying to say that the neutron irradiation is necessary. That's not optional. There aren't an infinite amount of options or other options that don't involve neutron irradiation on the shroud. That's the only option here. The hypothesis is specifying that it's because it had to be this way, because that's how he achieves his ultimate purpose in creation for as many human beings as possible, free will human beings as possible. Now, they were critiquing me and saying, well, you're assuming that's true. No, I'm not. No, we're 50-50. It's either true that God raised Jesus from the dead with neutron irradiation because he had a sufficient motivation or religious motivation to do so, or it's false. I'm not begging the question and saying it's true that he did, not with the prior probability. I'm saying 50-50 says it's either true that God rose Jesus from the dead with neutron irradiation because he had sufficient motivation to do so, or it's false. And given the absence of evidence at this point, background evidence presented, it would be 50-50 as the default state. Now, if you want to get into the calculation, here's how you would do it, right? So in the first place, we would have to look at this side of the equation, right? So what's the prior probability that Jesus would be risen from the dead with neutron irradiation, given God does not exist? Wait a second here. Now, this half of the equation, these are the naturalistic explanations, and they admitted, yeah, sure, that there could be natural things in explanations involving neutrons and stuff like that. But is this half the equation proving the resurrection hypothesis as I just defined it? No, because I said God is a part of it, right? So it's resurrection hypothesis is defined as God raised Jesus from the dead, because using neutron irradiation because he had sufficient motivation for doing so. So this would actually be 0%. If we're assuming God doesn't exist, not God, then it's 0%, right? And 0% times whatever you think the evidence against God, the evidence for atheism, say the problem of evil, all of these arguments and stuff like that, whatever you think that equals, 0% times whatever equals 0%. So this side of the equation, given how we're defining the hypothesis, is 0%. But I just want you to be clear. So if we slightly redefine the hypothesis like the skeptics do, and let's say we say, well, resurrection hypothesis is, what is the prior probability that Jesus would have rose from the dead involving neutron irradiations? So no mention of God. Well, in that case, maybe a natural anomaly happened. Maybe some weird kind of alien technology happened, whatever. This would be more than 0%. It might be very low. It might be 1% or 1/1000th of a percent or whatever numbers you think it is as you get into the reasoning and the evidence on that front. But it would be very low nonetheless. But that's why it's so key. Again, our hypothesis involves God from the beginning, that God, so we have to assume God exists, rose Jesus from the dead because involving neutron irradiation because he had a sufficient motivation for doing so. And a religion, authenticating a religion is a sufficient motivation, right? So these are all baked in to my prior premises of the argument, which go into how it's the background knowledge that I'm using to assign this probability at 50%. So what is the probability that God would have risen Jesus from the dead using neutron irradiation because he had a sufficient motivation for doing so? Well, what's the probability that that entails the resurrection hypothesis as we are defining it is true? Well, in this case, it's all about divine psychology. It's a matter of, well, God's omnipotent, he's omniscient, so he has all the prerequisites for raising Jesus using neutron irradiation. There's no problem there. And given we're assuming God exists here and stuff like that as part of the equation, the Jefferey Conditionalization Formula, mathematics demands it, I would say it's all depends on, well, did God have that motivation or not? Was there a sufficient reason for him to do so or not? That's the only question as to whether or not it's more probable than not, or improbable, or equally probable. And I would say it's equally probable. It's just a priori speaking, without having evidence speaking to God's divine psychology with respect to the resurrection hypothesis, it's 50-50. It's either true that he had the motivation, or it's not true that he had the motivation. We literally have nothing. As Mike Licona says, it's inscrutable in terms of a priori or prior probability assessing divine psychology. Maybe I'm wrong on that, but I didn't hear the Shroud skeptics providing, James or anyone else, give us proof, reasons, evidence. If you're going to say it's improbable God would raise Jesus from the dead with neutron irradiation because he had sufficient motivation, prove it. Prove that he didn't have the motivation to raise Jesus using these neutron irradiations for a sufficient, prove that he didn't have a reason to do so. That's what you have to do. Simply citing, oh, well, it's 1/3 because there are three different ways God could have done it. Okay, well, that's irrelevant to the hypothesis, right? The hypothesis isn't just that, what is the probability that God randomly raised Jesus from the dead using neutron irradiation as opposed to some other technique? That would be 1/3. No, but we're saying that God raised Jesus from the dead using neutron irradiation on purpose because he had a sufficient motivation for doing so. Prior probability of that is 50-50. It's equally probable. He either did have that motivation and therefore did it, or he didn't have the motivation and didn't raise Jesus using neutron irradiation. 50-50. I was correct. Now, obviously, you multiply that by, well, what's the probability that God exists? Given our background knowledge, that's where you get into the ontological argument, cosmological argument. Obviously, because of the ontological argument and properly based beliefs, I assign a 100% probability to this thing. I have zero doubts that God exists, defined as a real maximally great being. So this is how we do that. The skeptics didn't do this. They just assumed that this factor here is 1/3 based on random likelihoods, right? In their heads, they're going, well, what's the prior probability that God raised Jesus from the dead using neutron irradiation arbitrarily or randomly, right? Because for them, it's just, well, he could have risen Jesus other ways without neutrons. Then potentially there's an infinite number of ways to do that. But that's irrelevant. Our hypothesis proper is assessing the prior probability that God raised Jesus from the dead with neutron irradiation because he had sufficient motivation for doing so, meaning the neutron irradiation is the only way that we're considering. Did God have motivation to do it that way and no other? And I gave brief answers based on my Molinistic understanding of God's middle knowledge and how everything fits together, right? Dr. William Lane Craig goes over this. A butterfly flaps its wings. 5,000 people 500 years from now convert to Christ and get saved. We have no idea of predicting the causal chains and saying, no, it's improbable that more people would be saved or more people would achieve their ultimate purpose. So we just have no way of knowing as human beings. It's 50-50. Maybe if God raised Jesus using radiation, that would lead to more people being saved or more people achieving their ultimate purpose in creation. Or it's equally probable maybe it didn't. We have no way of telling as humans, but we know God does as an omnipotent being with middle knowledge. And so, okay, it just depends. Given what God is, if he exists, did he have the motivation or not? Is it true that he had this motivation and therefore raised Jesus with neutrons or not? 50-50. Yeah. So obviously, yeah, if you're more interested in more details on the mathematics, how it works, I've gone into great detail on this in my episodes and my slides called Calculus for Christ. So tune into that. We did a series of shows as to how my Bayes-ish method works as a simple, intuitive method for people who aren't into math and don't understand conditional probabilities and probability calculus and all this nonsense, as I didn't before. When I invented this Bayes-ish approach, it's because I didn't understand the Bayes. It didn't make sense to me. It does now that I'm a philosopher with a master's and stuff. I understand the proper way to use Bayes, and that is a good way to do it. But this way also works, right? And I use Bayes to get the cumulative probability based on all the evidences combined, directly proving the truth of my hypothesis, whatever that is, right? And in my case, it would be that Christianity was authenticated by God, right? That's where historical evidence for the resurrection, the formation of the Shroud images, vindication, prediction, they all are evidences that cumulatively support the hypothesis God endorsed Christianity as the one human beings should follow to achieve their ultimate purpose in creation. And I did the prior probabilities and all this stuff. So yeah, you can go to Calculus for Christ if you want more details, or I gave my personal testimony in more summarized form, less technical form, on a Reason and Theology podcast, giving my testimony from agnostic to Christian, to theist to Christian, or something along those lines. So yeah, and that should be it. So take care, everybody.